The December wind swept through the old stone courtyard of St. Catherine's Church, carrying with it the first snowflakes of the season. Margaret Hayes sat on the bottom step, her thin cardigan doing little against the cold. At 23, she'd never imagined she'd be here, homeless, hungry, and watching families stream past her into the warm glow of the evening service. Her blonde hair, once carefully styled, now fell in tangled waves around her shoulders. The olive green dress she wore had been her favorite once, back when she had a closet full of clothes and a future full of promise. That was before the medical bills, before losing her job, before everything fell apart like dominoes in a row. Margaret pulled her knees to her chest, trying to make herself smaller, invisible. She'd learned that was easier. People didn't see you if you didn't look at them. They hurried past, their eyes fixed on anywhere but the young woman on the church steps. The evening bells began to ring, their deep tones echoing through the courtyard. Margaret closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. At least the bells didn't judge. "Excuse me?" The voice was small, bright, impossibly cheerful. Margaret opened her eyes to find a little girl standing in front of her. She couldn't have been more than 3 years old, bundled in a red coat that made her look like a tiny cardinal against the snow. Her blonde hair was pulled into pigtails, and her blue eyes sparkled with something Margaret hadn't seen directed at her. In months, genuine interest. "Emma, come here," a woman's voice called from near the church doors. But the little girl didn't move. She tilted her head, studying Margaret with the unfiltered curiosity only children possess. "You look sad," the child said matter-of-factly. Margaret blinked, unsure how to respond. Adults pretended not to see her sadness. This child announced it like she was commenting on the weather. "I'm okay," Margaret managed, her voice rough from disuse. The little girl, Emma, stepped closer. "My mama says when people are sad, sometimes they need a hug." She paused, then added with absolute certainty, "I think you need a hug." Before Margaret could respond, before she could build her walls back up, Emma had wrapped her small arms around her neck. The embrace was warm and unhesitant, smelling of baby shampoo and hot chocolate. Something inside Margaret cracked. Her eyes burned with tears she'd been holding back for weeks. When was the last time someone had touched her with kindness? When was the last time anyone had seen her as a person who might need comfort? "Emma!" The woman's voice was closer now, tinged with panic. Margaret gently pulled back from the hug as a young woman in her 30s rushed over, her face flushed with embarrassment and concern. "I'm so sorry," the mother said, reaching for Emma's hand. She has a very big heart." "Emma, you can't just run up to people." "It's all right," Margaret said softly. "Really?" The woman paused, really looking at Margaret for the first time. Her expression shifted from worry to understanding. She crouched down beside her daughter. "Emma, that was very kind of you," she said gently. Then, looking at Margaret, "I'm Sarah Mitchell. That's my husband Daniel over there." She gestured toward a tall man in a gray suit who was approaching them. Do you have somewhere warm to stay tonight?" Margaret shook her head, not trusting her voice. Daniel Mitchell stopped beside them, taking in the scene. Where Margaret expected judgment, she saw only concern in his eyes. "The shelter on Maple Street is probably full," Daniel said, more to his wife than to Margaret. "It always is when the temperature drops." Sarah looked at her husband, and something unspoken passed between them. The kind of silent communication that comes from years of marriage and shared values. "We have a guest room," Sarah said quietly. Would you like to come home with us? Just for tonight. Get warm, have a hot meal?" Margaret stared at them. This had to be a trick. People didn't just invite homeless strangers into their homes, especially not families with small children. "We're not strange people, I promise," Daniel added with a gentle smile. "Well, maybe a little strange. Sarah insists on putting pineapple on pizza. It's delicious and I won't apologize," Sarah said, and despite everything, Margaret found herself almost smiling. Emma tugged on Margaret's dress. "Please come." "You can have cocoa, with the little marshmallows." Margaret looked at this family, this kind, generous family, and felt the armor she'd built around herself start to crumble. She thought of all the people who'd walked past her, all the averted eyes and hurried steps. And here was this little girl who'd seen her, really seen her, and decided she needed a hug. "Okay," Margaret whispered. "Thank you." The Mitchell home was everything Margaret had lost and more. It was warm, yes, but more than that, it was filled with life. Photos covered the walls, Emma as a baby, family vacations, candid moments of joy, the kind of ordinary happiness that Margaret had taken for granted once. Sarah showed her to the guest room, brought her clean clothes, and pointed out the bathroom with towels already laid out. "Take your time," she said. "We'll be downstairs when you're ready." Standing under the hot shower, Margaret let herself cry. Not from sadness this time, but from the overwhelming relief of kindness, of being treated like a person again. When she came downstairs wearing borrowed sweatpants and a soft sweater, she found Emma waiting for her at the kitchen table, crayons spread out in front of her. "I'm making you a picture," Emma announced. "It's a rainbow, because rainbows make people happy." Margaret sat beside her, watching the little girl work with fierce concentration. Daniel was at the stove, cooking something that smelled like heaven, while Sarah set the table. "So," Sarah said gently, sitting down across from Margaret, "you don't have to tell us anything you're not comfortable sharing. But if you want to talk, we're here to listen." And somehow, with this family she'd met less than an hour ago, Margaret found herself talking. She told them about her mother's cancer, the crushing medical debt, the job she'd lost when she took too much time off for caregiver duties, about her mother passing away anyway, despite everything, about the eviction notice, the car that broke down, the long slide into homelessness that happened faster than she could have imagined. "I had a degree," Margaret said, staring at her hands. "A good job. I was saving for a house. And then," she trailed off. "Life happened," Daniel finished quietly. "The way it does. Without warning, without mercy. My parents lost everything in the recession of 2008, Sarah said. "I was in college. Watched them go from comfortable middle class to food stamps in less than a year. My dad used to say we're all just a couple of bad breaks away from needing help. But they made it through," Daniel added, "with help from their community, from people who saw them as human beings who deserved dignity." Margaret looked up at them, tears streaming down her face. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Emma looked up from her rainbow drawing. "Because you needed a hug," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. That night, lying in a real bed with clean sheets, Margaret stared at the ceiling and thought about Emma's words. Such simple wisdom from someone so young. You needed a hug, and sometimes that was enough. Someone seeing your pain and responding with compassion instead of judgment. The next morning, over breakfast, Sarah and Daniel told Margaret about a friend who ran a small accounting firm, someone who might be willing to give her a chance. Daniel offered to look at her resume. Sarah mentioned a program at the community center that helped people get back on their feet. "We're not trying to fix everything," Sarah said, "but maybe we can help you take the first few steps." 3 months later, Margaret stood in the lobby of Anderson and Associates Accounting, wearing a professional blazer Sarah had helped her pick out from a consignment shop. She had her own apartment now, modest but hers. She'd started her new job 2 weeks ago, and today she was waiting to meet with her boss about taking on more responsibilities. But first, she had a stop to make. At St. Catherine's Church, Margaret found a young man sitting on the same steps where she'd sat that December night. He looked exhausted, defeated, invisible to the people streaming past him. Margaret sat down beside him. He glanced at her warily. "I know how hard this is," she said gently. "I was here, right on these steps 3 months ago." His eyes widened slightly. Margaret pulled out a bag from the sandwich shop down the street. "I brought you lunch, and I know it might not seem like it right now, but things can get better." She handed him a card with Sarah and Daniel's church group information, resources for the homeless shelter that had helped her, the community center's number. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Margaret smiled, thinking of a little girl in a red coat. "Because someone once saw me when I was invisible. Someone once gave me exactly what I needed, kindness without judgment. And now I get to pass that forward." She stayed with him for an hour, just talking, listening, being present, being the person she'd needed that night. Because sometimes someone just needs a hug, and sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change everything. That evening, Margaret stopped by the Mitchell home for dinner, a weekly tradition now. Emma ran to greet her at the door, arms already spread wide. "Maggie!" she squealed, using the nickname she'd given Margaret. As Margaret hugged the little girl who'd saved her life, she thought about how grace arrives in unexpected packages, how a child's simple instinct for compassion had been worth more than all the social programs and resources combined. The world could be harsh and unforgiving, but it could also hold families like the Mitchells, little girls who believed sad people needed hugs, and second chances that arrived dressed in red coats on snowy December nights. "I made you another rainbow," Emma announced, pulling her toward the kitchen. "This one has a unicorn." Margaret laughed, a real, genuine laugh, and followed the little girl inside, into the warmth, into the grace of being seen, into the life she was rebuilding one day at a time. All because someone had looked at her and seen not a homeless woman to avoid, but a person who needed a hug,